Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'd first like to acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich, who continue to have relationships to this place today and continue to carry so much knowledge around how we can live in this place properly today. We're so excited here at CIRCLE, the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement, to be welcoming Kevin Bruyneel for the first book launch of the term, his new book, Settler Memory. Before we jump into that, though, just a reminder for folks that we're also hosting a SAGE graduate student workshop tomorrow that's open to anyone who's interested in coming. And that is from 12 to 1:30, titled Navigating the Research and Publishing Process. And Kevin's graciously agreed to meet with graduate students, and I'm sure also new faculty, junior faculty who might have questions around research and publishing. So please join us tomorrow at noon. You can go to CIRCLE's webpage or social media for the links to register there. Jumping in for today, we have Kevin's going to first speak a bit about his text, Settler Memory, and then we'll be joined by three respondents. So many of you have probably had a chance to pick up the book and know a bit about it, but for those who don't, Settler Memory, its description asserts that faint traces of Indigenous people and their histories abound in American media, memory, and myth. Indigeneity often remains absent or invisible, however, especially in contemporary political and intellectual discourse about white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racism in general. So in this ambitious new book, Kevin Bruyneel confronts the chronic displacement of indigeneity in the politics and discourse around race in American political theory and culture, arguing that the ongoing influence of settler colonialism has undermined efforts to understand Indigenous politics, while also hindering conversations around race itself. By re-examining major episodes, texts, writers, and memories of the political past from the 17th century to the present, Bruyneel reveals the power of settler memory at work in the persistent disavowal of indigeneity. He also shows how Black and Indigenous intellectuals have understood ties between racism and white settler memory, even as the settler dimensions of whiteness are frequently erased in our discourse about race, whether in conflicts over Indian mascots or white nationalist underpinnings of Trumpism. So envisioning a new political future, Bruyneel challenges readers to refuse settler memory and consider a third reconstruction that can meaningfully link anti-racism and anti-colonialism. So Kevin Bruyneel is professor of politics at Babson College. And again, his book, Settler Memory, The Disavowal of Indigeneity and the Politics of Race in the United States, was published in the Critical Indigeneity series of the University of North Carolina Press in 2021. He presently writes on the relationship between race, colonialism, collective memory, and racial capitalism. He's published articles in History and Memory, Settler Colonial Studies, Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal, and the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy. His first book was The Third Space of Sovereignty, the Post-Colonial Politics of U.S. Indigenous Relations. He's of settler ancestry, born and raised in Vancouver, British Columbia, the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Bruyneel completed his BA at Simon Fraser University and his MA and his PhD at the New School for Social Research in New York City. And at Babson College, Bruyneel's teaching courses in political theory, American politics, critical race studies, Indigenous studies, and radical politics. So we're so grateful to be able to have Kevin with us today. And so we've generously given the task to three scholars to take up the numerous arguments put forward in this book. First will be Jeff Corntassel, who's a writer, teacher, and father from the Cherokee Nation. He's a professor in Indigenous Studies at the University of Victoria here and the Associate Director of the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement, which essentially means he can't say no when I ask him to have to read books and engage them. So he's also, his research and teaching interest focuses on everyday acts of resurgence and the intersections between Indigenous resurgence, climate change, gender, and community well-being. Jeff situates his work at the grassroots with many Indigenous-led community-based programs and initiatives ranging from local food movement initiatives, land-based renewal projects to gendered colonial violence and protection of homelands. He's currently completing work on his forthcoming book on sustainable self-determination, which examines Indigenous climate justice, food security, and gender-based resurgence. Christine Obonsawin has also graciously agreed to speak to this text, and she's also from the University of Victoria. She's Abenaki or Odanak, and has been a guest on these lands for a number of years, and is grateful to the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples for the opportunity to live, work, and raise her children on these territories. Her scholarship in Indigenous studies and sport history takes up questions regarding the appropriation and subjugation of Indigenous peoples, identities, and cultures in Olympic history and future programming of the Games. Christine's recent scholarship has mainly focused on the legal and political rights of Indigenous people in settler colonial Canada, particularly in hosting the Olympic Games on treaty lands, as well as those territories that remain treatyless or unceded. Though of course we'd say they're all unceded. Christine remains committed to researching, writing, and teaching in areas related to sport, Olympic, and Indigenous histories to support the advancement of Indigenous rights in settler colonial Canada and beyond. So again, thank you, Christine, for joining us today and looking forward to your comments. And Corey Snellgrove is a settler and postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. So recently finished his PhD. Yay, congratulations, Corey. And also for those who don't know, just had a publication come out in Theory and Event, coming out from his dissertation work. So I encourage you to check that out. So his research examines the politics of reconciliation, the articulations between colonialism and capitalism, and Indigenous visions of decolonization, especially Indigenous treaty visions, as a critique of capitalism. So his book project underlines the importance of social form and subsequently criticism to the study of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations and the politics of difference more generally. So whereas early approaches in political theory that address settler colonialism have focused on the fact of coexistence, he argues that the struggle of our age are critical struggles over the form of coexistence. So again, I think these are three great scholars to take up the chapters and arguments you've laid out, Kevin. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And so the format, for those who don't know, will be that Kevin will speak for a bit, and then we're going to turn it over. Each speaker will have, 8 to 10 minutes to reflect on the book, raise some questions for Kevin. We'll give it back to Kevin to respond, and then open to audience questions. So I think because there are so many folks here, that when we turn to the question part, if you could just put your questions in the chat and I can moderate those. So that's how we'll run that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Kevin. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Just make sure everybody can hear me. I don't want to end up in those Zoom weirdness where I'm talking for 10 minutes to nobody but myself, which is just what I do generally. First, just a huge, huge thank you to Heidi for the invitation, to Hector for the work in organizing, and to the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement, or CIRCLE. It's really nice how that phrase lined up and became CIRCLE. That's a nice coincidence. And it's a real honor. I mean, truly an honor and humbling to be speaking to you all and to so many scholars and students who I respect and if you read my acknowledgements, you're going to see so many names of people who are on this call who have influenced me, taught me so much, have been comrades and friends, generous readers. So, I mean, I can't be more honored and humbled to be talking to you all and having this conversation and hearing from Christine and Jeff and Corey. I'm really looking forward to that. So this is not a venue for a long 35-minute talk. It better not be, because I didn't prepare one. It's going to be just a short bit of like sort of what led me to the project, some sense of what I think I'm doing with it, and sort of an arc and sense of what the chapters are accomplishing, and maybe a little wrap up. And then I'd love to hear from everybody, and I'm very thankful for people engaging with the book at all. So as I say in the book, in many ways, what led me to the project, I mean, after Third Space of Sovereignty, which tried to engage in the way in which US politics and political science was not engaging with Indigenous politics and sovereignty, really think about what I saw to be the history of these struggles outside of and against this sort of liberal multicultural framework. And that was sort of Third Space of Sovereignty's, I think, agenda. Moving forward in my career of reading and teaching, and I really became frustrated with what I saw to be sort of limitations or sort of boundaries around a race discourse, and in academia, in teaching, in pedagogy, and in politics, in which a lot was accomplished, but I think because of an inability, or as they say, a disavowal of indigeneity and settler colonialism, there's limitations to how we conceptualize the stakes of race politics, the actors in race politics, and even the major ways in which we think about forms of domination. And so in the book, just to give sort of a taste of some of the things I touch upon, for example, I compare early on the treatment of Rachel Dolezal and Elizabeth Warren, and the way in which different ways in which claims to Blackness and claims to indigeneity are treated in, as I'm focusing on the US context, but I think it can be generalized in many ways. And what's going on there beyond just sort of a hypocrisy, but something about what's seen and deemed to be politically a high stakes issue, and what is sort of just the background of what I think to be whiteness in the US, nationhood, that Kim Tallbear has talked about too. In another book I talk about in historical work, Winthrop Jordan talking very openly about how in his work, his brilliant work, White Man's Burden, he openly said he was planning on talking about the history of the Black experience, the Black struggle, and Native people, but he dropped, in his words, he dropped the Indians. It was just too much to figure out how to bring things together. And this is a common theme of not so much a lack of knowledge about a history, but a disavowal, and I don't think necessarily a disavowal with cruel intent, but not knowing how to bring these conversations together. And then around the Reconstruction era, in which, and I talk about W.E.B. Du Bois's brilliant canonical Black Reconstruction, in which land is central to the project, but the story of land and where that land comes from and the place of the indigenous peoples and settler colonialism, it's not so much that it's an issue that's not part of Du Bois's narrative on its own. He had enough tasks in front of him, but those of us who inherit this text and reread it seem to be in different ways not attending to some of the core issues. And to me, this is not so much about an erasure on its own, but how indigeneity and settler colonialism and say questions of land, and I think settler masculinity and domesticity are in the background, never centered in a way to really think about not so much what it would mean to have mere inclusion in a multicultural sense, but really what it means to foreground and talk about the relationship between land and labor, between whiteness and settler masculinity, heteropatriarchy and colonialism, and racial domination and anti-Blackness. These are hard things to put together, but I think once we start to try to figure out how to ways to bring these together, and we can start to, I think, open up conversations about what white supremacy means in the contemporary era, what racial capitalism and the stakes are, the relationship between abolitionism and decolonization as world-building projects. And I think there's a lot of clearly collaborative possibilities and shared comradeship, but also I think there's a lot of conversations that are going past one another. And so this also emerged very much out of teaching and trying to teach race studies and indigenous studies in a US framework in which the students had a vocabulary to talk about race in certain ways, but less so in terms of indigeneity and settler colonialism, and doing more than just juxtaposing, but talking about the relationship amongst them. And so just a couple of points to emphasize. One is why memory? For me, history matters, obviously, education matters, facts matter, but facts don't speak for themselves. And what memory does, it's constitutive of identities, collective identifications, commitments, and it's clearly memory, the politics of memory is an intense side of politics. We think about the structures, the battles over statues and memorials and the names of universities and the 1619 Project and 1492 and 1776. These are not minor battles. They're claims and battles, fights over who we are collectively in this world today and our relationship to how our memory shapes past, present, and future, including future commitments and our relationships to one another. And I think memory is a site that is explored in many ways, but I think it's underexplored as a site of politics. And then why disavowal? I said disavowal as opposed to say ignorance or erasure, because certainly there's a lot of ignorance about history. And we need to, as many of us as educators are committed to dealing with that. But I think in many ways, that's the easier move. I have a quote in the book early on from James Baldwin, in which he says in his letter to his nephew, many white people know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity, which I connect as a political and an ontological loss. To talk about disavowal is to talk about refusing this disavowal is to talk about our relationship to one another, our commitments to one another, because to talk about relationships to the actions we take based upon the knowledge we have. And it's not to say that more knowledge isn't necessary, more research, but I think there's also, and part of what I get to settler memory is there's some sense of an awareness and then a gesturing towards and away from, because to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. And one of the dangers is what it means when our settler identities and privileges and inheritance are actually put as part of the stakes of our contemporary politics. And so that's why disavowal, I think, is important to me. And then I'll just give a sense of the arc and the purpose of the chapters, and then turn it over to my respondents. I have chapters on Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, the Reconstruction era, and W.E. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and on Baldwin, each in their own chapters. And these are all formative frameworks, narratives, moments, and authors in critical race studies, education, politics in the US. Bacon's Rebellion is seen to be a sort of foundational moment in the history of where whiteness came from. Reconstruction, clearly, we're now in a period of talking about a third Reconstruction, of the lost opportunity of the cross-racial class coalition. And then Baldwin as maybe the preeminent figure in terms of who people have been reading, especially in recent history. All are folks all periods, texts, authors who I've learned so much from and indebted to. And my analysis is not a dismissive one at all. To the contrary, it's sort of an imminent critique and a recuperative reading of what else can we get out of these particular moments. These are inherited memories of key periods in I think US and general racial history, such as Bacon's Rebellion, such as Reconstruction, that are often reproduced habitually. We just talk about these moments of Reconstruction or Bacon's Rebellion as somehow being these touchstones, without, I think, unearthing and thinking about what kind of memories are being passed on. And I want to intervene in that and think about other ways to capture and to articulate those memories. And then I move into sort of more, I don't know if they're prescriptive readings, but how to refuse settler memory and the examples of, say, sports names and Trump and Trumpism, because we all have to write about Trump, don't we? And for the sports names one, it begins with a very basic premise that is familiar, I think, in the context, which is one particular representative from Minnesota saying, why do teams get a free pass when it comes to naming teams after Indigenous people or stereotypes and not other groups? And certainly it's racist, but it's not only racism. You have to talk about colonialism and dispossession and elimination. And in that debate, in that discussion, in that politics, that's not part of the conversation. So there's a limitation of how we're thinking about the stakes of this particular example of the naming, as much as there's some positive direction in dealing with some of these. And in Trump, certainly a white supremacist, but I'd say a white settler masculine nationalist. How do we explain the diversity of some of his supporters? A lot of, especially men of color, do support him. And certainly there's white supremacy there, but there's a certain type of settler masculinity that he's invoking and a celebration of conquest. It doesn't answer everything, but I think some ways in which we frame some of these debates around white supremacy or whiteness limit rather than open up possibilities for understanding it if we don't account for the history of settler colonialism, settler masculinity, indigenous peoples' politics and claims. And then I end by trying to think about different ways to refuse settler memory and turn, I hope, the reader to such important authors as Layli Long Soldier, Christina Sharp, such directions in terms of collaboration as We Are All Treaty People and No One is Illegal, that I think are engaging in forms of refusal, to sort of help with vocabulary, for taking what I think is a strong direction of race politics, but I think in some ways has run up against certain limits. So I hope in some sense that the settler memory analytic provides a way to open up and provide a vocabulary to open up different conversations and different ways to think about the political stakes and how we all, I hope, see ourselves as invested in those stakes and building a better world. So I'll stop there, but that's some capture of what I think I thought I was doing. And my respondents maybe will tell me I was doing something else. But thank you very much for everybody being here and for this launch. I'm just, again, truly honored.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think we'll start with Jeff. We'll just go in the order of the bios as I mentioned them. So we'll go Jeff, and then I'll turn it over to Christine and then Corey.
Excellent. Wado, Miigwech, Heidi, and yeah, Wado, Kevin, for writing such a powerful and engaging book, and for your conversation here. I'm looking forward to engaging with you on this. And so I'll time myself. Heidi, I guess you can give us kind of a high sign if we're going a little long. But yeah, just to say that, yeah, I found it really intriguing, and, you know, especially around the idea of settler memory and how it's been used in so many different ways to discredit, use the word disavow, diminish, and even destroy any critical conversation around genocide, around dispossession. And as you pointed out, it has so many implications for counter monumentality, right? To taking down those historical monuments, for even critical race theory, and how critical race theory has been treated and banned in some schools throughout the US. And I was thinking of even Heidi's work on criminal empire. So it also has that implication for how Indigenous bodies are criminalized in defending the land, right? So in order for the state to continue or subsist. And so I think the, it essentially, I think you do a great job of really leading the reader to understand how memory is captured and ultimately weaponized, in ways that discredit and ultimately disavow the not only Indigenous presence on the land, but our self-determining authority. Like, how else can UNDRIP be side by side, with all of these other colonial policies, right? And you could think of other ways that self-determination has been exerted, and so I think of as a counter to that, I think of remembering as a form of resurgence as well, right? The way it's claimed by Indigenous peoples to remember beyond the life of the state. And so the state is providing its own kind of life story or creation story. And so remembering for Indigenous peoples is a way to have that longer sense of time and that longer sense of even peoplehood. You brought up peoplehood so nicely on page 15. I wanted to share a story that'll lead to a question. And maybe this book prompted some flashbacks on my part. So this is a disturbing story. I'll forewarn folks. But it was in 1998, and I went to a conference in Colorado, and a group of us, a small group of Indigenous students and scholars, we went to the Natural History Museum in Colorado and Denver. And we were walking towards this diorama of a Lakota village. And these two kids kind of ran by us, and they were shooting imaginary guns, just, finger guns at the diorama and saying, "Shoot the Indians." And one of them said, "I killed the baby," right? And so this is all unfolding right in front of us. And such a horrific thing to see reenacted, right? A genocidal impulse. And so we're so upset by that. We went to the parents, and this is where my question comes in. We went to the parents and asked, we said, this was a really disturbing thing to see. And obviously these kids learned this somewhere. And so you should address this. And what was interesting is, so it's almost like when confronted with disavowal, what the parents did is they turned to us and said, well, educate our kids. Tell these kids how horrible this was and do this work for us, essentially. And so we refused. We refused to do that and said, this is up to you to actually do the work of educating, these children about the implications of their actions. And so that has stayed with me for quite a long time. And I don't know, it kind of reemerged probably in your discussion around mascots, because mascots are often kind of substitutes for that notion of genocide, that notion of, this is the way we honor you. And so my question for you, one of the questions is, how does this morph into something from disavowal to something maybe slightly different, of offloading that, in terms of offloading that responsibility, and in ways in which, when you're confronted with that disavowal as settlers, how does that get recalculated? How does that get changed to somehow shift the labor to Indigenous peoples, to Black and Indigenous bodies, to undertake this work? And the threat is always implicit that if you don't do the work, no one will, right? Only why this is so offensive. And so it's this offloading of responsibility. Anyway, so that was one of the questions that came out of the book, is how do we get away from that circular kind of argument to something that is truly decolonizing, something that is not pinning the decolonizing work on Indigenous peoples, on Black and Indigenous bodies. Yeah, and I think, how am I doing on time, Heidi? 3 minutes? Okay, I'll speed it up. There's so much in this book, so I'm just really, I really love the conversation, really a conversation that never occurred in real life, but a conversation that can occur in this book between Baldwin and Vine Deloria Jr., right? And I'm thinking of, some of Vine's work where he talks about how people are always disappointed meeting Indigenous peoples, because we can't stand up to that expectation that has been kind of embedded in these images, embedded in people's settler memories, basically. And so, and he came up with this kind of Boy Scout theory that people are basically lashing out because of their Boy Scout image doesn't match up with the current realities. And so I love that section. The other section I wanted to talk about maybe is on your notion of racial liberalism. And I was thinking on page 122, you talk about how even after Chief Wahoo was retired by the Cleveland team, they're still selling merchandise. And I think of this happening in different ways. So in what ways does settler memory continue on even when there's a formal retiring of that image, or even when the monument has come down? In what ways does that continue on? And in what ways is neoliberalism and as kind of a stand-in for the continuation of this practice, right? So And I saw that with even in Blacksburg, Virginia, where we retired 4 mascots, and yet people continue to celebrate the Indian, right? In private or in maybe not so private settings. But the image itself is still embedded in people's psyche, ultimately their memory. So how do we counter that? And also, what is the role of neoliberalism? That is this kind of notion of market citizenship. Sure, we're going to turn over the proceeds now to diverse interests, to different charities. So we're changing something. We're somehow magically whitewashing it, even though we're still promoting this harmful image. And so I think, and then my last question is, I love the final chapter. It's all about refusal of settler memory and Black Indigenous solidarity. And you cite a lot of different authors, a lot of poets in this work. And I was wondering if you could maybe address what is the role of artists in decolonizing praxis? And so what are some of the ways in which artists have not only tapped into our psyche, but have challenged those notions of settler memory? So I'll close there. So Wado, thanks, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And I'll turn it over to Christine.
Great. Thank you, Heidi, and the folks at Circle for inviting me to be a part of this very exciting panel in the launch of Settler Memory. It's a true honor to be here today and to have the opportunity to respond to Kevin Bruyneel's timely and, may I add, truly illuminating book, and to engage in this conversation moving forward. When Heidi asked me to sit on this panel, I agreed without any hesitation. I knew this opportunity would give me the chance to finally sit with what looked to be a thought-provoking new book. It certainly didn't disappoint. Admittedly, after the first few days, the reality of responding to a book that deals largely with the politics of race in the United States had me second-guessing my perhaps overzealous decision to sit on this panel. However, after reading the opening pages, my misgivings began to lift. As I immersed myself in the book, I immediately recognized that many topics had direct relevance in my personal and professional life, and that with this book, Bruyneel offered me, and I'm sure many others, with critical insights and interventions on how we might refuse settler memory moving forward. This book is rich in detail, political theory, and critical reflection. And so there's much to explore, but for the sake of time, I want to focus on 2 specific aspects of the book. First, I begin by recognizing how settler memory resonated with me on a personal level, acknowledging how the functions of settler colonial memory have affected my family, community, and nation in very real and tangible ways. Throughout my life, I have heard multiple references to the seeming disappearance of my nation, to us as Abenaki people. Such settler colonial histories largely originate and have been predominantly disseminated in US settler colonial discourse, and yet they seep into the stories, politics, and kinship relationships of my family, community, and nation, affecting Abenaki people on both sides of the US-Canada border. In my professional life, I've come to recognize this as a form of historical erasure that functions to dispossess Abenaki and other Indigenous nations of our lands, and thus served and serves colonial settler ambitions, not only in the US, but also Canada. In Settler Memory, Bruyneel draws on the important work of scholars such as Jeannie O'Brien, Henri Bergson, Paul Ricoeur, to underscore precisely how the work of settler collective memory and habit memory work to dispossess Indigenous peoples of our lands and further disavow our existence in the present. In Bruyneel's words, quote, "In a settler society, the work of collective memory serves to reaffirm the settler claim of belonging to, appropriation of, and authority over lands on the one hand, and the disavowal of the genocide, dispossession, and alienation of Indigenous peoples on the other hand," end quote. Importantly, Bruyneel juxtaposes the functions of collective memory and habit memory against Indigenous practices, drawing specifically from Lakota forms of memory production, largely premised on fundamental relational elements of individual and collective being. Bruyneel not only offers an insightful discussion on the ever slippery collective memories that prevail in settler society, but centers the words and works of esteemed Black and Indigenous scholars, artists, and activists such as Christina Sharp, Lele Long Soldier, to uphold new frameworks and new bases that can be found in practices such as wake work, thereby shifting and radically altering dominant forms of memory production work in white settler colonial context in the United States, and may I add, Canada. As some of you know, my scholarly interests mostly concern Indigenous sport history. So you'd probably expect me to respond to Bruyneel's attention in chapter 4 to the controversial topic of Indian mascots. So of course I'll need to weigh in here. Admittedly, the mascot issue is not a topic that I have proactively taken up in my own academic writing. However, it is a subject matter that seeps into many realms of my scholarly life, sometimes under the most hostile of circumstances. And for me, like Jeff, this book prompted many flashbacks, some very uncomfortable and disturbing ones I won't get into here. But to go on, I acknowledge that I wholeheartedly agree with Bruneel's deduction that the Indian mascot debate has almost exclusively been taken up in sport history as a matter of race and racism. To the best of my knowledge, settler colonialism and thus settler memory have yet to be taken up in scholarly discourse. Beyond properly recognizing the work of settler memory as a primary reason why Indian-themed sports teams and mascots persist as popular representations into the 21st century, Bruyneel uses the mascot debate as a prominent example in US popular culture to expose the ways in which racial liberalism predominates in 21st century US politics, and in his estimation, at the direct expense of radical anti-racist and anti-colonial perspectives. As Bruyneel rightly reasons, the long overdue decision to change the name of the Washington football team in the summer of 2020 was prompted not by the long-term activism of predominantly Indigenous women that spanned multiple decades, but rather the, at the time, relatively short-term movement for Black lives. Further, through his interrogation of anti-Black racism throughout the organization's history, Bruyneel makes important linkages, thus offering new perspectives concerning anti-colonialism and anti-racism in the past and present practices of this organization. What struck me as most intriguing was Bruyneel's positioning of land within this contentious debate. Again, to the best of my knowledge, the violent nature of Indigenous land dispossession has yet to be centered within this hotly contested debate. Bruyneel draws attention to this exceedingly important matter, focusing squarely on US federal politicians pressuring of Washington's white supremacist owner to integrate Black players into the team, which they eventually did in 1962, the last NFL team to integrate, not because it was the right thing to do, but rather because the US government threatened to deny the use of the stadium, which stood on federal lands, or more accurately, illegally seized Anacostan, Piscataway, and Pamunkey lands. In my estimation, Bruyneel's attention to settler colonialism and the ways in which it is advanced through settler memory is an exceedingly important reframing of this controversial debate, recognizing and naming the subjugation and dispossession of Indigenous peoples, which continues to cause great harm to this day. On a final point concerning the Indian mascot debate, I want to focus attention on a section titled Two Defenses of Mascotry and Anti-Colonialism Responses. In this section, Bruyneel highlights two main arguments that are incessantly put forward to carry on with the ill use of Indian mascots presently. First, he highlights how those within the organization have long suggested that the name represents an important tradition worthy of respect and preservation. In the end, Bruyneel comes to a similar conclusion as do many sports studies scholars concerning the racist history and white supremacist attitudes and leaders within this organization, past and present. However, to Bruyneel's credit, he interrogates the matter further, thereby infusing an anti-colonial critique to this important history and its work in settler memory, thus placing, quote, the team's name into historical and mnemonic perspective as part of a persistent, deeply rooted settler colonial logic and set of practices traceably from the past and present, and thereby trying to rather than cleaving it from the history and present of settler day colonial governance, end quote. The second argument Bruyneel presents in this section is that such names, logos, and mascots serve to, quote, honor Indigenous peoples, which is no doubt an old and worn out argument used to advance racist and white supremacist ideas. Here, Bruyneel engages in a robust discussion drawing from the important work of Tulalip scholar Stephanie Freiberg and her colleagues, drawing critical attention to the psychological impacts of mascotry on Indigenous youth. Further, Bruyneel exposes how typical discussions surrounding the debate are habitually defined through racial logic and thus centered on race. Once again, he infuses an anti-colonial lens to expose how such problematic representations serve to stabilize white superiority in the US vis-a-vis the seeming disappearance of Indigenous peoples and the replacement narrative of and claim to settler belonging. In further regard to Brunel's treatment of honoring, I was surprised to see that he did not take up the question of Indigenous consent that all too frequently leaches into these debates in highly contentious ways. The more recent scramble to secure Indigenous consent might be understood to be what Eve Tuck and Wang Yang referred to as a settler move to innocence, and in my estimation is worthy of further exploration, specifically as it becomes entrenched in settler memory. To close, I wish to draw attention to an argument developed throughout the entirety of the book and eloquently summarized at its conclusion, which speaks directly to me as a historian and somebody who holds deep commitments to decolonization. Bruyneel recognizes the importance of history to our understanding of the past. However, he goes on to remind us that genuine engagement with radical politics movements requires, quote, a turn to a political memory in which knowledge, myth, and lessons are mobilized to political ends through narrative built out of intergenerational memories, unimaginable, imaginable lives, and co-inhabitations that rewrite and reimagine the story of the past that is not past to open up possibilities for the future, end quote. This is a powerful reminder to us all, Indigenous and settler, regardless of where we situate ourselves in the academy or where they situate us, in speaking back and against the work of settler memory. Uliuni, thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Such great reflections. Looking forward to Kevin's response, but first we'll turn it over to Corey.
Okay, thank you, Heidi, for the introduction, but also for the invitation, to Christine and Jeff for your comments, to Hector for organizing, and to everybody else in the audience for being here. And last but not least, Kevin, to writing this fantastic book. I'm just going to get right into my comments here. So beginning with the third space of sovereignty and continuing through indispensable articles such as social science and the study of Indigenous peoples' politics, Kevin Bruyneel has offered a critical deconstruction of political science and American studies. His work has been marked by a serious consideration of the theoretical and political interventions of Indigenous studies and political movements. His work's considerations into the disavowals of the discipline I find myself in have been clarifying, while his relationship to Indigenous studies offers a model, I think, for non-Indigenous engagement too. I suspect as or if departments catch up, the importance of his intervention will be marked by their inclusion in core curricula and field exams. And I also suspect that scholars being trained in Indigenous studies will find his work useful for positioning themselves in relation to such a hostile discipline if they so choose. But the book that we're here to discuss today, Settler Memory, The Disavowal of Indigeneity and the Politics of Race in the United States, continues this critical deconstructive work, though now more for critical race theory, the anti-racist left, as well as anti-racist liberals. Of the many things I appreciate about the book is its response to both the dilemmas of teaching, of how to bring together critical race theory and Indigenous studies, and of social movements, of how to craft solidarity through difference towards universal emancipation. In so doing, he joins a small but growing cohort of critical intellectuals, attending to the seriousness of racial domination, in particular anti-Blackness and settler colonial domination, by presenting their co-constitutive relationship, This rejects recent tendencies that posit one form of domination as the ground for all others, and slightly older tendencies of positing one revolutionary subject position, at the same time that he constructs the very grounds for solidarity in a convergence of interests towards the unification of abolition and decolonization. In doing so, Bruyneel also offers a model of how to think histories of domination and ideas of freedom intersectionally, something that a minor but burgeoning tradition in the history of political thought and empire has struggled to do, I think. So I think the best example of this comes from Bruneel's rereading of Bacon's Rebellion, to draw attention to the motivation for a cross-race alliance in a desire for indigenous land and as a defense of the domestic realm, where whiteness is forged through settler colonialism, anti-Blackness, and patriarchy. Now, another strength of settler memory is the mode of his criticism. So Bruyneel offers critique in a generative way, eschewing tendencies of conceptualizing critique as a tearing down. And I think this is a valuable object lesson in the classroom and for social movements too. So if I had a bit longer, I would give an example of this through a reading of Bruyneel's reading of Du Bois, but I'm just going to skip that to get to sort of the comments that I want to and questions I want to raise for Bruyneel. But just for the sake of understanding, I think we can understand Bruyneel's critique of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, again, imminently. So the critique there is that he sees Black Reconstruction and the memory of Reconstruction as all about land, but risking missing both indigenous dispossession that frames that debate about land, but also what land means. And so there's a risk here of reducing land into property. And so the first set of questions I want to ask today concern the grounds for solidarity. And I think this is more of a clarifying question. And this, in the sense that it's about how does Bruyneel's imminent critique of Du Bois relate to Du Bois' grounding of the possibility of solidarity across race in class. The second set of questions addresses the politics of socialism, because of course, part of the memory of Du Bois, the debate around Du Bois concerns his socialism. So I'm curious about what the relationship is between settler memory and Du Bois's version of socialism, but also what Bruyneel's settler memory analytic, as well as his general methodological move of centering critical indigenous theory and politics, provokes for the future of socialism in North American settler societies. So I'll start with the question of solidarity. One of the criticisms Bruyneel makes of Du Bois and anti-racist left's formulation of the wages of whiteness is that it downplays material benefit. When we understand whiteness as formed in a co-constitutive relationship with anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, we see how whiteness offered the material benefit of land in addition to the psychological wages rooted in the subordination of Black life. So for Du Bois, it seems that this emphasis on psychological over material benefit was also key to his consistent appeal to white workers, even at his most critical. This is because it enabled Du Bois to distinguish between what Vanessa Wills describes as relative versus absolute privilege. So what does this mean? While white workers were privileged relative to a racist capitalist society, they were not privileged absolutely. For Du Bois, socialism would enhance all workers' lives. So for Du Bois, the fact that whiteness produces psychological wages both could explain the failure of cross-racial class solidarity and provided its potential. The idea that white privilege was relative to the existing order, but not absolute, opened the possibility for solidarity across class and against race. In other words, it represented the condition of possibility for a transformation from a class trader to a race trader. So my question concerns what follows from your intervention here, that whiteness provided the material benefit of land, for both Du Bois's position and approach to privilege and solidarity, but also to ask you about your own thinking around solidarity. So is there a way to recognize this material benefit of land while insisting that it remains a form of poison bait? Or is this off the table for you and how we ought to conceptualize settler colonialism? If possible, though, how much is this recognition a discursive strategy versus a more material development? Say the result of an increasing concentration of industry and land that accompanied a society defined by market dependence that Du Bois himself points to. So where the potential for solidarity develops historically. I ask this not only for clarification on how your conception of solidarity might differ from Du Bois, but also because I think part of the allure of Du Bois in our moment stems from Trumpism that you speak about in the conclusion, and the oft-repeated claim that Bernie would have won. And I think you're sort of pushing back on that too, but also, like, again, imminently to those traditions. So in short, how do you conceptualize the grounds for solidarity between Indigenous peoples, white settlers, and racialized arrivants? At the end of this chapter, as well as the conclusion of the book, there does seem to be a narration of struggles as related but separate, with a moral and legal call for non-Indigenous peoples to join Indigenous peoples in pushing for the honoring of their claims. This is distinct, I think, from Du Bois's conception of solidarity rooted in class. And so this distinction between relative versus absolute privilege. So now I don't mean to eschew moral and legal motivations for solidarity, but I'm curious as to whether you think a more Du Boisian class framework for solidarity is possible in struggles against settler colonialism as well. So that's the first set of questions. The second is now going to turn to Du Bois's vision of an anti-racist socialism. So as you quote in the book, and I love this moment, you note how Du Bois presents Reconstruction as a brief moment whereby there was a dictatorship of the proletariat. This preceded the Paris Commune. This preceded the Russian Revolution. But as you also point out, when Du Bois describes Reconstruction as an incipient anti-racist socialism, he notably leaves out red, a racial signifier for Indigenous peoples. It's a dictatorship of the proletariat, which Du Bois describes as uniting black, brown, yellow, and white. Doesn't say anything about the red. So my second set of questions concerns the relationship between settler memory and socialism. Namely, does one reflect the other? For example, how much is Du Bois's vision of black, brown, yellow, white, but not red socialism a reflection of traditional Marxism with its emphasis on labor, again, something that you're sort of trying to push against, or market socialism? So in your reading of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and Reconstruction more generally, you importantly draw attention to how Sherman's orders and the Freedmen's Bureau more generally also tended to pair heteropatriarchal domesticity with the expectations of productivity in relationship to land and labor in a market system. So there's something about this sort of still retaining of a market system that leads to this exclusionary socialism still. Now, following Bruyneel's method of immanent critique, one might ask if there are certain tendencies within Du Bois's writing on socialism that might be held up over others because they can be developed through the construction of an anti-racist, and now, after Bruyneel's intervention, anti-colonial socialism. So I want to highlight three before concluding with what I think Bruyneel's sort of method of focusing and foregrounding Indigenous critical theory might also offer to this question. So in his 1913 article, Socialism and the Negro Problem, Du Bois explicitly challenges socialist focus on exploitation over exclusion and voice on the grounds of strategy and principle. Yet, and from a consideration of settler colonialism that Bruyneel offers here, or the settler memory analytic, this conception of a socialist politics is still problematically oriented by integration. Now in his 1935 article, A Negro Nation Within the Nation, Du Bois suggested a version of Black separatism founded on self-sustaining cooperative economy as an alternative to Booker T. Washington's integrationist politics. So we have a sort of a better development, I think, here of Du Bois's position, one more perhaps open to the settler memory intervention. Now, to be sure, this piece is quite brief, but I think a lot rides on the relationship to the larger nation. And now, interestingly enough, and I think this is a method that Bruyneel invites, is to sort of bring the Black radical tradition and the Indigenous radical tradition together. This approach to self-determination in Du Bois is in many ways echoes Oneida leader Laura Kellogg's approach to self-determination through cooperative economic production in her 1920 text, Our Democracy in the American Indian. Now, putting Kellogg and Du Bois in conversation is fascinating because in doing so, the larger nations in both thinkers' work gets troubled. And again, this follows, I think, Bruyneel's efforts of bringing the Black and Indigenous critical theoretical traditions in conversation, raises a speculative question that Bruyneel often ends his immanent critique and the chapters that are about immanent critique with. So what might these experiments in cooperative economy look like if they're oriented both towards their own and one another's needs? So the final sort of like alternative Du Boisian analysis here comes from his 1956 article, If Eugene Debs Returned. And this is because the question of voice participation and so freedom and self-determination becomes more central in distinguishing between collective policies oriented toward profit and socialism proper. So Du Bois writes, socialism includes planned production and distribution of wealth, but a completely socialist result depends on who does the planning and for what ends. So I think this framing of the question of socialism in a more political register seems more germane than contemporary yet nostalgic yearnings for an exclusionary welfare state, as well as for an anti-racist, anti-colonial socialism in the present. It seems to my mind one of the major failures of North American socialism, and I think this is something that we might extend the settler memory analytic to reveal, is this presumption of the who and what ends of this question of planning. Now, again, returning to another cornerstone of Bruyneel's work, that is, it takes seriously Indigenous visions of decolonization, I think could furnish a productive dialogue around socialism in settler societies. Is not treaty also a question of who does the planning and for what ends? While Indigenous treaty visions tend to set limits towards those ends in regards to relationships to land and other than human kin that Bruyneel draws out at the conclusion of this book, but also even within the Black Reconstruction chapter, the emphasis on ongoing responsibility towards one another seems to address the problems of a racist exclusionary socialism so well diagnosed by Du Bois. Similarly, mutual flourishing as an aim of treaty echoes Du Bois's understanding of the welfare of the people as the ends of socialism. So to sum up, I think in both content and form, Kevin Bruyneel's Settler Memory offers a compelling intervention, challenge, and framework for educators, intellectuals, and activists interested in the questions of abolition, decolonization, and ultimately universal emancipation from below. The questions I've raised here are just sort of things that the book provoked for me as I was especially focused on this Du Boisian intervention here. And so thanks again, Kevin, for writing this, for listening to these comments, as well as everybody else in the audience, and for your words and the conversation to follow, and for spending some time with us today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Kevin, if you have some responses and reflections from these three comments or commentators today, and then open it to some audience questions. So again, folks in the audience, if you have some questions, if you could put those in the chat, that would be great. And Kevin, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thanks, Jeff and Christine and Corey for these comments. It's generative and challenging, and I'm excited that these questions have emerged. So obviously I'm not going to run through everything because I want to make sure we have time for questions. I think just sort of to take a sample of all these really sharp ways to think about it, and I hope for me, really think about the implications of what I've tried to talk about. To Jeff's point too, I think just to get to the offloading of responsibility, that to me is settler memory. That's disavowal right there. I think part of the way I think about, you never know who your audience is for a book. And my audience is whoever's willing to read it. But in many ways, when I think about how I've generated it and talked about it and taught through it, and also try to think about who I think are the people who need to listen and engage, and I say this in the intro, is also those of us who are settlers who have to think about our implication on our relationship to settler colonialism today. And so the offloading to me, that it's somebody else's problem, whether it's a diversity, equity, and inclusion seminar that's run by the same group of people, that's exactly the problem. And that's racial liberalism, and that's settler colonialism. And I think part of it is to push it back on ourselves, to think about, to come back to the Baldwin quote, that it is to be in some degree of danger to move from that disavowal to refusing it, to evolve, to understand that it is a bit of danger to understand that we are implicated in this project, but that's actually the work that needs to be done. And so I think your gesture to say it's not my responsibility, it's your responsibility, is completely obviously the right one. And that to me is what I hope in terms of, and I'll maybe get into with the sports names, is to say, this is a conversation that there's a deep, to sort of to connect to the sports names. I think the sports names issue becomes so fraught, to get to Christine's point and to Jeff, your point about these issues, because you talked about the Boy Scout image of themselves, which is the notion there's a deep sense of personal identification through these images. The honoring defense is both racist and bullshit, and also the people truly believe it. There's some sense of, there's some identification of who they are. You know, what Kim Tallbear says, there's not a full erasure, there's a deep sort of like ways in which the first blood of the Native American is part of the constitutive soul of the settler, right? And so you're dealing with this form of identification that has to be called out as such. And so this is part of what this effort to call it, to name this disavowal. And this is why I think there's an avoidance of the colonial part of it. It's actually easier in some sense to point to Chief Wahoo and say, that's racist and offensive. Let's put it to the side and we'll sell a few trinkets of it and then give them away, to think about what are the different colonial implications of this image of the genocide that's being reproduced, and the identification that fans have with this particular mascot as really a sense of who they are as settlers, although the settler claim is not going to be as forefronted for them. And the honoring is of a people of the past, so to speak, who have been dispossessed, who have been genocided, and we have taken over their place. Replacement narrative, as Jeannie O'Brien would say. And so racial liberalism gets us to the point of at least acknowledging the offensiveness and getting these a little less on the public stage. And that's an accomplishment. Certainly, we don't want these names. But you know, when I saw the Cleveland one was actually finished, was done just as I was finishing up the book, and I was like, okay, I'll incorporate it. And then I immediately saw that they were still selling part of the memorabilia and so on and so forth. And to me, as you said, it was neoliberalism, which there's still a market for it, and we're not going to give up that market for it. There's also, because it's also deeply tied to settler memory in terms of this deep identification with it, one sense of who one is. Dan Snyder, you know, one of the most heinous people in football, speaks of a tradition, and I think he's serious. This is our tradition. This is who we are. So it's not merely a sort of artificial, superficial, thin attachment. It's a deep sense of self that I think involves. And so the work is actually, and when I'm teaching, and I have a predominantly white institution, is to say, like, this is not only like awareness. This is actually thinking about what are the commitments we have to take to move forward to actually address this in our, whether it's one's own politics, engagement with others. And so so this to me, what you're talking about is in terms of racial liberalism, is both in some sense gets us a few steps forward, but then because it's so limited in its what it can do politically, ends up to be, I think, 3 or 4 steps back, because then the idea is, well, we've got this off the public stage and it's no longer an issue. And it's also a form of understanding anti-racism to be more about offensiveness, social and psychological forms of racism, and not structural issues. And so the reason I brought up the issue of the land, in this, because land is fundamental not only to the history of, say, the Washington football team, but also the timing of when these mascots emerge is around the time of allotment policy. And, you know, part of the lowest points of Indigenous population, in which indigeneity as human beings, as in terms of boarding schools, are being pushed to the side, land is being claimed, and you know, Philip Delory has articulated this very well. And racial liberalism only sort of gestures towards and reproduces a type of multicultural neoliberalism, accomplishing some in terms of getting these off the stage, but still reproducing these as identifications, really important identifications for settlers. And the move is to not let settlers, in terms of whom I engage with, off the hook on that. And that actually, there's still ways in which our politics have to be willing to be in danger and move towards the larger implications of why do we live in a particular culture. And it's US and Canada. I don't talk about Canada, but as I say in the book, Canada is, you know, the most overrated country in the world. I'm not letting off the hook. Why are we still producing particular groups of people as these stereotypes and not others? And that's the form of colonialism that actually has to be centered. And the question about artists is, to be perfectly honest, Jeff, and I'm the least poetic person in terms of poetry, but I think it's also I turn to poets and to artists as a way to a fundamental reimagining. Artists, we go to artists, in my view, my uninformed view, because we are open to having things reimagined for us. And poets actually allow us a way to reimagine the way we put and relate to our world in a way that sort of standard texts, I think, don't always appeal to sometimes, because people are looking for the answer. Where I think poetry pushes our imaginations and reconstitutes the way we can imagine ourselves in relationship to the text and one another. And that's why I find poetry powerful for a way to hopefully push my reader to a reimagining of how we're living together, and artists generally. So that's just, I mean, thank you for that. That's just a few ways in which I sort of respond to. I think also yours and Christine's, in terms of Christine, Indigenous consent is it's one of those things where I thought about, it's how settler memory, I think, it's a question I was asked yesterday. How do I think about settler memory in terms of how Indigenous peoples themselves can engage in settler memory in different ways in terms of forms of consent? And so I don't know that I ended up finding a way to engage with it. I think it's a very legitimate, probably absence from the book in terms of things not addressed. Certainly, I think that part of the defense that comes up with the Washington team is they would bring out certain Navajo people for the first game, right? So there was a setting up people as symbols of a form of, and so I do mark that a little bit, but I think it's also a question of how settler memory, I think, can be so hegemonic that can be reproduced by many peoples. And then just to sort of, to get to, I wanted just a couple of things with Corey's comments on socialism. First, in terms of Du Bois, I had to make a decision of keeping the book strictly to Black Reconstruction because, as Corey knows, and people have read it, that my concern is certainly I'm engaging in an image critique of Du Bois, not because Du Bois has a much more complicated relationship to Native American politics in his own practices, but because that text is so canonical, and in terms of race studies, in terms of how one thinks about the relationship between race and class and the role of Reconstruction and the memory of Reconstruction today as people are talking about and making a claim for a third Reconstruction. And so this is a type of powerful political memory for academics, for leftists. Certainly Du Bois's entire writing and arc provides, I think, resources to elaborate and beyond just what's going on in Black Reconstruction. But what I do want to say and point out that part of the project is also to say that absolutely a socialist left focuses on labor at the expense of land. And I mean at the expense of land, not necessarily just the exclusion of land. And part of the ideal coming out of Black Reconstruction is the notion of a redistribution of land is going to provide the economic basis and the political power for this cross-class coalition, cross-racial class coalition. This, I think in our contemporary context can see that as deeply problematic and colonialist and reproducing settler colonialism. So for me, I am definitely pushing to think what a anti-racist socialist left politics when critiquing of racial capitalism, what does it look like if it's not addressing the issue of not land not as property, but as relations to land? And I think the one thing I'd add, and then I'll stop and I look forward to questions, is also to think about, for settlers, to what degree, certainly land for a good portion of settlers is the source of one's own domination of others, but to what degree is also land relations and property relations the source of domination of oneself in terms of desires for, in terms of the different ways in which we think about aspirations for property. And so I think that actually can be turned into a collaborative mechanisms as we talk about with labor and surplus value, to talk about accumulation, domination, and exploitation. But certainly I think a left project that is not addressing stories of land, Indigenous country sovereignty, thinking, I think now very evidently about land back, is then threatening to reproduce settler colonialism. And not only for me, that in of itself being a problem, but I think it actually, part of what I argue is I think that it's not the reason for the failure of Reconstruction. The failure of Reconstruction is deeply tied into US dynamics at the time, but I think certainly is a recipe for failure again, to not think about collaboration in a much wider sense. So I'll stop there because I know there's a few minutes, 15 minutes left, so I want to open it up. But thank you. This is generative, and I'll be thinking about these comments for quite a while. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think I'll just throw a couple of the questions at you, and if we need more clarification, we can get the folks to kind of jump on directly, but I'll just give you a couple of them to maybe respond to back to back. So Joanne Barker has raised a great question, asking if you could speak a bit to the anti-critical race theory legislation in Virginia and elsewhere, following the kind of anti-Mexican studies in Arizona and anti-ethnic studies everywhere. And then another kind of question that I think touches on a few of the questions folks have raised, but in a way we haven't really talked about yet, is Anita's question. So she says that she's only read the preface and intro, but she's wondering if this is read in a kind of Canadian context, especially in a place like UVic, whether there's a risk of reinforcing another dyad of Indigenous settler. That's so much more prevalent, for example, in conversations. I think that's why she's specifically looking to UVic, right? And so she said that is methodologically, there is a naming in the preface of the author's relation to Stolo lands and a citing of Lee Miracle. Similarly, in the terminology, there's a somewhat careful elaboration of Native, Indigenous, etc., but no real engagement with Black indigeneity or Indigenous Blackness in different ways, including people who are both Indigenous to Turtle Island and Black. So again, she's saying if that's not clear, she's happy to step on, but you know, I think it's a great question also about like the ways in which the dyad changes in kind of the different geographic context. So if you want to take those two up, and I'll move through a few of the rest of the questions coming in.
Sure. Thank you very much for those. To Joanne's, I mean, the way I think about, I mean, there's the CRT controversy political fight now has everything to do with Black Lives Matter of 2020. Certainly you had Christopher Rufo, who was a major antagonist, but was a way in which it could mobilize as a wedge issue without people saying they were directly anti-Black Lives Matter, although many did. And what it's become is a battle over political memory in a very direct way. I mean, a number of the such as Virginia and other places say, you can only talk about this period of history in this way. And some of them, including Wisconsin, say you can't do a land acknowledgement. So there's a very direct effort to say, you can only, we are telling you exactly not what the history is, although they'll say that, but this memory is going to be about 1776, not 1619. And so it's a direct and overt battle over the role of political memory in the classroom, or theoretically in the classroom, because CRT is, of course, not taught in K through 12. But I think that for me, in terms of the CRT, it's also, when I teach and talk about it, it's to push this debate back into the relationship to Black Lives Matter and anti-racist politics that's going on, and issues like the defund the police and so on and so forth. I think that's the imperative for how the anti-CRT became this particular wedge issue, in particular, like very popular issue for people running for office. It also connects very clearly to the way in which children in schools get politicized, and adults end up projecting issues onto what's going on with children in schools in terms of CRT. But it's I don't even know if it's a fight about political memory, but political memory becomes the theater, the vehicle for, I think, a effort to disavow, in some sense, the relationship to the emergent Black Lives Matter movement, to contemporary anti-racist politics, and to talk about race at all. Within the CRT, other than the examples I've given, such as the one about Wisconsin land acknowledgements, there's less to do with teaching of Indigenous studies. There's some in some regards, but a lot of it is focused on 1619. And so I think the politics of that and the political memory of that is certainly fraught. I get nasty emails often from people about this stuff. I'm not sure if that's where Joanne was thinking of wanting me to address in the question, but that's what I think about in terms of what I think is about going on in that debate. In terms of the settler Indigenous binary and Black indigeneity, I'm not sure if I do satisfy the question. What I try to do in the intro is to mark out the problematic of just separating Blackness and indigeneity, to talk about this complex relationship, and moving towards, as I think about a liberatory politics and a collaborative politics, a lot of the ways in which I moved the different chapters is towards Black Indigenous solidarity, including implicitly, maybe more than implicitly, Black indigeneity. But certainly Black Indigenous solidarity and refusing either a Black-white binary or a settler-Indigenous binary is where I move the project as it moves towards the refusing side of it. So ending with thinking about, so I think about Layli Long Soldier and Christina Sharp as sort of in conversation and providing us them together with a type of way to think about how to think about the past that is not past and the future. And so I don't think I probably addressed Black indigeneity in a way that is sufficient. I would say that for sure. Well, maybe not for sure, but off the top of my head. But certainly, I try to be, as I move the project, thinking not in terms of just reinforcing, even in conflict, settler indigeneity in Black and white, because that is again a juxtaposing what is a much more co-constitutive, mutually constitutive set of relations. That's at least the aim, and whether it mapped out, people will tell me. Thank you for the questions very much.
Great, thanks, Kevin. I'm going to put two more together that kind of work together just to keep you on your toes. So the first one comes from Erwin, who is essentially asking about like the readiness of settlers to kind of confront kind of, to confront history or their understandings of history.
Yeah.
And so Erwin states, as I see it, the work of settler decolonial academics is to support settlers and institutions to overcome denial, to address genocide. So from your position, both as someone who's been in BC and then now in the States, as well as having written the book, is settler readiness different here, for example, in the unceded territories of the Coast Salish compared to other places? And how is the terrain of settler readiness different in like places like BC from, the Eastern United States? So I think that's the essential question there. And I'm going to put that one with Rita DeMoon's question, which I think is also about different kinds of subjectivities. So DeMoon says, could Kevin talk more about the debates on settlers? Who are settlers who are creating memories of disavowal? I'm thinking here of the positioning of Black people who are descendants of enslaved people, or those Afro-Caribbean people who recently arrived in the US as settlers, or unsettled settlers, or something else. Settler memories of, say, Sikh diasporas, or those Japanese interned. I wonder if your concept of settler memory shifts when read through the lens of race politics, as well as Indigenous politics, such that it has a transnational component. And then she said that may not be a clear question, but I think it's pretty clear. So there it is for you.
It's clear. I'll first start with Erwin. Erwin and I used to hang out back in the mod scene in Vancouver back in the 80s. So great to hear from you, Erwin, through Zoom. Well, I'm probably not the best person on this call to talk about settler readiness in BC, to be perfectly honest. I've been so distant from the context that I don't want to claim. I got the heck out of Canada when I could. I went to the US, maybe a mistake, but nevertheless. So I don't know that I am really the best. What I would say, and this comes out of part of this came up in the conversation yesterday, I don't know what a book can accomplish. I don't want to overdo it, but what I hope to do is provide some sense of a vocabulary, an analytic to open up and direct conversation and engagement collectively in conversation with others that maybe was not on the table before, or at least can provide another avenue. I certainly feel like I felt this way very much when I moved from BC to New York in 1991, so long ago, that there was at least some degree of a vocabulary in the Canadian context that there was not, especially on the East Coast. At least like the language of treaty, of blockades was at least present, even if you weren't really paying attention as a young person, which I don't know that I was. So I would hypothesize, but I might be wrong, that there's more settler readiness, but it probably gets collapsed into the type of work that I think Corey does about reconciliation and recognition. That's not the type of politics that I think a lot of us would want to be talking about. On the East Coast, I don't think there's much settler readiness. No, I mean, in terms of engaging, that's part of the frustration. Is to try to figure out a way to take a very discourse around that is basically a racial liberalism discourse. I mean, we had MLK week this year and MLK week this week and MLK Day yesterday. And the president of my college, and it's a business college that specializes in entrepreneurship, put out an email to the whole college saying MLK was a case study in entrepreneurial leadership, right? And so, this multicultural neoliberalism, which MLK, I mean, we're just waiting for Burger King to do their MLK, deal on burgers. And so, racial liberalism so shapes things. And actually, I will say, I had my first class with my students today. They're in no way radicals, but they're pretty attuned to the problems with racial liberalism. They don't know where to go with it. And so for my class, we're bringing in, we were thinking about MLK through a discussion of economics and the Poor People's Campaign, and also looking at Kent Mockman's paintings and starting to think about relations between different articulations and histories and contemporary voices. So in terms of readiness, Erwin, I wouldn't say I'm very optimistic about the US, but I do think part of it is trying to push back against far too comforting racial liberal discourses in the US that I'm at least trying to center in the book, and then start to demand some degree of refusing of disavowal about the way in which indigeneity and settler colonialism is in the background of that conversation to get it foregrounded. But I'm not, as I say, I think others on this call might speak better to the readiness in the BC context. I'm just, it's been so long. To Rita's question of who are settlers, I do address in the intro, keep forgetting how they frame our chapters, that I say, no, I mean, there are Kamau Brathwaite's and then Jody Bird building on Brathwaite's notion of a ravance, which I think is productive. But I say explicitly the Black people descended from enslavement, but also through forced migration, are not settlers. And I have a very basic formation of a people who have never been allowed to settle in the first place. Part of what I talk about in Black Reconstruction is what I call layers of dispossession. Well, of course, we talk about Indigenous dispossession from land that we're familiar with, I think, folks in this call, but also for all the ways in which we can think about what 40 acres and a mule might have meant and the relationship of the land of that promise was almost never fulfilled. There's layers of dispossession that aren't the same dispossession that we know about the state and non-state violence towards Black people, Black communities who have never been allowed to be settlers. They're never allowed to settle. There's settler imaginaries, there's settler ideals, there's settler visions. And so part of what I build upon Aileen Morton Robinson a lot to think about whiteness. To think about whiteness is to think necessarily about settler identity and settler political positioning. And it's not to say that you let people off the hook, so to speak, for settler ambitions and policies and practices, but I think politically, I try to make clear that I don't construct Black people as settlers, and part of it is the political history, and in Black Reconstruction to talk about what I say are layers of dispossession going on. And this may get back to Corey's point of it, that you have a system which is not allowing, never allowed Black Americans to have the very land claims that were promised, right? And we can talk about intergenerational wealth. So when we're talking about labor, if we're not talking about land and relationships to land, I think we're not imagining a world-building socialist project that actually is dealing with all the different functions of power or domination, materiality, those things that would make a fulfilling life. So it is something that I try to address and make clear about, because I'm for the very reasons I articulated. And the question was clear. I'm not sure if the answer was.
That's great, Kevin. Thanks so much. I think I got to most of the questions, and I know we've kept you on a lot today, and we'll be keeping you again tomorrow, and already had you yesterday. So just to make sure to respect your time and others, I think I'll just wrap us up here. But I just want to again express my gratitude to you, Kevin, for letting us engage in this dialogue with you and your work, and for joining us today. Also to Jeff Corntassel, Christine O'Bonsawin and Corey Snellgrove for your thoughtful reflections and engagement with the book. Circle will be sending all of you gifts for your time and for sharing your good words and thoughts with us today. So you'll be receiving something from us, just a little more awkward in the Zoom format, but thank you so much. And again, for folks who joined late, Kevin will be with us tomorrow from 12 to 1:30 for a SAGE workshop on research and publishing. So do go to our website and register for that. And again, just want to say thank you and raise my hands to all of you for being here, and to this audience for joining us over your lunch hour and being with us today. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And I think, Hector, you can go ahead and stop the recording.
Great.
And then for anyone who